In the extended essay, I look at the literary and cultural influences that formed Dunbar's aesthetic, the anxieties these influences produced, and Dunbar's use of the Black spiritual as the forge and the flame with which he sought, with greater and lesser degrees of success, to purify the disparate elements of his inheritance and meld authentic expressions of culture in both literature and performance. This latter aspect of the Dunbar tradition extended after his death by the Dunbar Speaker and Entertainer, edited by Alice Dunbar Nelson and described by Akasha Hull, appropriately enough, as one place where the oral and the scribal meet. Meanwhile, Charles T. Davis wrote that Dunbar's primary literary conditioning in high school was one that gave importance to romantic voice. Marcellus Blount's work on race and gender in the sonnet reinforces the importance of romantic poets as models for Dunbar and his work. And there is the influence of Burns, who Dunbar read through the eyes of the Romantics. Though Dunbar used a slightly different ballad form, poems like Confirmation, The Spelling Bee, and In Summer contain probable references to Burns, who, as we know, also wrote dialect poems, songs, and ballads. Dunbar was frustrated, both as a romantic poet and a local color writer, but where others saw him as a Black Robert Burns, he may also have seen himself as a Black John Keats. He had good reasons to identify with each. All three men came from humble origins. All three loved the ladies, or perhaps more precisely, each loved being in love, and each died young. Each received the barbs of critics, but Keats, like Dunbar, felt the keener sting of reviews of his poetry that at times plunged him into the depths of depression. Both Dunbar and Burns drank enough to damage their health, and Dunbar, like Keats, lived in a world where consumption, tuberculosis, was rampant and death was always near. So I try to complicate my earlier readings by looking more closely at Dunbar and thinking about how he might have viewed himself. From among these, this is Mr. Keats, from among these and other revisions underway, I will look today at just one, the influence of both Joshua and Matilda Dunbar. Not just as parents, but as heroes, artists, and viable models. Upon this last point, I will expand, in part, to share a unique material object that prompted the revision of my earlier views of these relationships. As Addison Gale observes, Dunbar's first attempts at writing poetry were in the language spoken by his parents. And he told the stories of his parents' generation, both in standard English and the dialect, which Gale says Dunbar's parents did not speak. A stunning and perhaps the best known example is when Melindy sings about Matilda Dunbar, the person Dunbar was arguably closest to for most of his life. But because Dunbar wrote, "We wear the mask," I remain suspicious of Gale's assertion that the Dunbars spoke only standard English. The portrait of Dunbar and mother on the Wright State University website exemplifies this wearing of the mask, a dignified but private and a partially concealed self. While the unwritten rules of public engagement and negotiation outside the home dictated the use of more formal language, centuries of oral play and practice do not die in a single generation. Like many African Americans today, the Dunbars may have been culturally fluent in multiple linguistic codes based in motherwit or Why should the world be overwise? Being recognized as one of the custodians of Dunbar's legacy has put me on point in unexpected ways. 4 years ago, I opened an email from Bud Cole, an 80-year-old man, a white man from Scottsdale, Arizona, who had lived next door to Matilda Dunbar at 221 Summit Street in Dayton when he was a child. Bud wrote, "For a very long time, I have been wondering what to do with a quilt that Matilda Dunbar gave to my mother in about 1927 or 28. We always referred to it as Mother Dunbar's quilt, and my memory tells me the quilt was made from scraps of his childhood shirts and her dresses. My memories of her to this day are very vivid. My sister and I frequently would go over to Matilda's, and she would sit in a rocking chair, holding us on her lap, and sing lullabies and songs to us in a soft, sweet voice. The tattered quilt with its hexagonal pattern and cleanly articulated and carefully finished edges, is the work of an artist of fine sensibility. Are we looking at a fragment of one of Paul Laurence Dunbar's baby shirts? I believe so. Or at least, I believe that Bud Cole believed so. Among the other things that Mrs. Dunbar gave to Cole's mother were Christmas cards, photographs, and a copy of When Melindy Sings. Here is an answer to Alice Walker's question: what did it mean for a Black woman to be an artist in our grandmother's time, in our great-grandmother's day? For Matilda Dunbar, it meant being a laundress, a songstress, quilt maker, and mother. She sang to Paul, taught him to wear the mask, and gave him his first lessons in aesthetics. Can you not imagine Paul Dunbar as Laius in the morning? Dunbar reinforced his home training in masking and double vision with frequent visits to his father in the Dayton Soldiers' Home. We know something of Joshua Dunbar's experiences as a fugitive from his son's short story, The Ingrate, where the hero tricks the master into teaching him to read and write so that he can write his own path to freedom. Although there is variance between the details of the experiences of the fictional and non-fictional Joshua, we do know that Paul's father escaped to Canada and then returned to Ohio, where he joined the Massachusetts 55th Volunteer Infantry in the spring of 1863. The historical Joshua, the real man, found himself stationed at Folly Island, South Carolina, working as a laborer, building fortifications and doing the heavy lifting that white soldiers refused to do, sometimes under enemy fire. He who had been enslaved by the Confederacy now found himself virtually enslaved by the Union, ridiculed and abused by men wearing the same blue uniform as he. After being injured in August, Joshua received a medical discharge in October, and 4 months after that, he played another trickster's move, re-enlisting in the 5th Massachusetts Colored Cavalry, a fighting unit. Refusing to be a slave to either the North or the South, Joshua Dunbar served at a time when the mere sight of blacks in uniform enraged Southern soldiers who often murdered wounded troops on the field. There were ample opportunities for heroism in Joshua Dunbar's military career. Around the time that he participated in the siege of Petersburg, a number of wounded black troops also fighting in Virginia were killed and buried in unmarked graves in what became known as the Saltville Massacre. Wounded soldiers were even taken from their beds in a field hospital and executed. Dunbar's understatement in emancipation and the colored soldiers may be a response to Northern racism. When they listed colored soldiers, follows Laius into war through the eyes of his sweetheart, but begs the question of the manner of his death and burial. Like others of our martyred soldiers, Laius lies in an unmarked grave. Black soldiers in Dunbar's poems are almost always depicted as men who were at all times ready and willing to fight bravely to solve the disputes of the white men who abused them. Though Dunbar paints his father's comrades as heroes, these poems are filled with strategic silences, a negotiation with an audience that in large part didn't want to know too much. In summary, we can complicate our understanding of Dunbar's work in productive ways by throwing off some parts of our critical inheritance, especially, as Jean Jarrett's work suggests, Howell's preoccupation with Dunbar's racial purity and the resulting dictum, along with other dismissive myths and misreadings. There is value in reading Dunbar as both a romantic poet and a local color writer. And there are many other ways to put Dunbar at the center, both thematically and formally. For example, by discussing his notions of romantic love and friendship by drawing near, we can generate the capability, the spark, to make Dunbar new again. Thank you.